normally?
On a day-to-day basis?
Yeah.
At least like 30.
30?
Yeah. Okay, we're good.
Good morning and welcome to this Hudson Institute event on Nicaragua. I am Dan Batlle, Adjunct Fellow here at Hudson, and it is truly a privilege today to welcome Francisco Aguirre-Sacasa. Francisco has a long and distinguished career as a banker and diplomat, working at the World Bank for 28 years before serving as Nicaragua's ambassador to the United States and later as Foreign Minister of Nicaragua and as a member of Nicaragua's National Assembly. The regime that has been in power since 2006 in Nicaragua has become increasingly authoritarian over the years. A UN report recently concluded that President Daniel Ortega and Vice President Rosario Murillo have been perpetrating violations and abuse in a widespread and systematic manner for political reasons, constituting crimes against humanity. In the context of this heightened repression, Francisco was arrested by Nicaraguan police in July 2021 and imprisoned until his release in February of this year. Francisco, thank you for making time today to join us at Hudson.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Dan, and to be here at the Hudson Institute.
Let's start with your arrest. Many of the people who were arrested around the time of your arrest were planning to run for different offices in elections in 2021 or were politically active. You had withdrawn from politics in Nicaragua. Can you talk about the reason for your arrest?
You know, that's a great question, and I wish I knew why I was detained at the Costa Rican border. I had a hip problem at that time, Dan, and I was flying to the U.S. out of Liberia on Delta because I was a Delta frequent traveler. And I was coming here to have a hip operation. And when we got to the Nicaraguan border, as myself and my wife, in her case, there was no problem, but in mine, they took away my passport, and then I realized that I was in trouble. They said, go back to Managua and fix your legal problems. And I said, I don't have any legal problems. They said, go back to Managua. So at that point, I jumped in my car with my driver and my wife, and we were driving back to Managua, and all of a sudden, we began to see police cars begin to come after us. And we were running at about 100 kilometers an hour, which is 60 miles per hour, trying not to outrun them, but trying to get to Managua as quickly as we possibly could until we got to a bridge. And there I knew we wouldn't be able to cross it. And there I was arrested. I was put in a pickup truck. My wife, happily, was not in any way molested on that occasion. But that night, when I went to El Chipote, which is the political jail in Nicaragua, we have a political jail in Nicaragua. She tells me that a lot of police showed up at our house and basically took all the computers away and went over that house looking for I don't know what. I was in jail for about 550 days altogether. But I wasn't alone. There were altogether, just in El Chipote, 222 other Nicaraguans who had been arrested in different moments. Some of them were still actively involved in politics. Others were prominent figures in Nicaragua, but not necessarily politicians. For example, the Bishop of Batlle, Rolando Alvarez, was in jail, along with 5 or 6 other members of the Batlle clergy. This was part of a major campaign that the Ortega Murillo regime has against the Catholic Church. It has closed down all Catholic schools in Nicaragua. It has forced out of Nicaragua all the foreign nuns who were there, Trappist monks who had a retreat house in a remote rural area in Nicaragua were all thrown out. And the action of this government has been the worst that we have ever had in our very troubled history. Daniel Ortega and Rosario Murillo have been a nightmare for Nicaragua, and it's reflected in many, many figures. For example, you had a lot of problems. You have a lot of problems, you think, in your southern border because of people who come from Mesoamerica. but most of the Central Americans who arrived at your border were from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. There were virtually no Nicaraguans who were trying to get into the U.S. I was looking at the figures of Nicaraguans who were detained at the border last year, and it was almost 250,000. These are people who have left the country either to go to Costa Rica or, in this particular case, to come to the U.S. in numbers that you never had before. And this is because of the terrible conditions that exist in Nicaragua right now. Daniel Ortega and his wife are the Ceausescus of Latin America. You remember the Ceausescus are the family that ruled Romania for many years. And I would dare to say that Murillo, the vice president or co-president of Nicaragua, is generally viewed by the Nicaraguan people to be the person who really calls the shots for this government. It's not so much Daniel Ortega, it's Rosario Murillo, who's really the most prominent actor on the political front for the Sandinista government.
So before your arrest, the Nicaraguan government had passed new laws creating a new category of crimes against the state. Was that the legislation that was used to justify your arrest?
Ultimately, yes, because I had a kangaroo trial in Nicaragua, as did most of the others. We didn't go to the normal tribunals. My own trial was held in El Chipote. There was a judge there. I remember that I had a lawyer, I'd retained a lawyer, which was an unnecessary expense in reality, because that lawyer was not going to have any impact at all on the outcome of that kangaroo trial. But I remember that at one moment, he asked the only witness against me, a policewoman, whether any of the proofs that had been provided by the government to justify the pretense that I had worked to undermine the sovereignty of Nicaragua was right or wrong. And she, obviously had not been well trained, said no, there's no proof that he did this. And at that moment, my lawyer got very excited, very happy. We're going to win this thing. And I said, sit down and don't worry about it. This judge knows exactly what's going to happen. 2 minutes later, of course, I was condemned to 8 years of prison. And so did all the others. They had a 1,000% batting average. All of the others who were at El Chipote, the 222 of us at least who were there and who were submitted to that same farce of a trial, were all condemned to periods that ran from maybe 12 or 14 years down to maybe 5.
And many of the other prisoners experienced solitary confinement, insufficient food, were held incommunicado for months at a time. Did you experience any of these things?
I was never alone in a cell. In fact, in some cases there were as many as 4 of us in cells that were relatively small. It varied. I do remember that on one occasion, none of the cells had glass, which meant that we had a lot of problems with mosquitoes that would come in. When it rained, the rain would come in. I remember that at one point, one of the cells that I was in actually flooded. We had about 4 or 5 inches of water on the ground, and it was very cold that night. It does get cold. Chipote is up high, and it was towards the month of November, which is one of the colder months in Nicaragua. And I remember that conditions there were not ideal, but I was never alone. Right across the way from me, on the other hand, there was a prisoner. Her name is Tamara Davila. She had been in jail about the same amount of time that I had been. I think she was involved in some kind of an NGO, obviously perceived by the government not to be friendly to the state. And she was alone, but she was not in a tiny space. She had a cell that was just as big as ours. All of the cells that I was in, and I was in several of them because they would rotate me from cell to cell, and they would rotate people in and out of the cells so that we were never there for a very long time with the same people. All of them had a little solarium. We called it a solarium, which was a tiny little room that did have access to sunlight. So in my particular case, lack of sunlight was never a problem, but losing not more than, but 2 years of my life at the age of, when I was captured, I was 76 years old. So at this stage in my life, I was about to begin to finish off a book that I was working on. I publish books in Nicaragua from time to time and write frequently in our newspapers. And that was 2 years that I was not able to do anything constructive and positive in my life until I got a knock on the door. There were two others in my cell with me at 3 a.m. telling us that we had to get out of our prison garb and put on this clothing, because each of us had a little bit of civilian, let's say, clothing. And we were told that not to ask where we were going, but to put on this thing and be ready in 10 minutes. This was on February 3, 2023. 2023, yes. February of this year. We had no idea where we were going, and all of a sudden, all of us were in a sort of a holding pen where there were over 200 of us there, and none of us had the faintest idea where we were going, but we all had on civilian clothing. One thing I should mention is that every day I was called out of my cell, and I had my blood pressure taken by their nurses and doctors. And this, I think, was the result of two things. There was a general officer from the Sandinista army who was one of those who was in jail with us, because not all Sandinistas are Orteguistas, by the way. And he passed away. He died of cancer in El Chipote. They never allowed his family to see him, by the way. And in fact, they only got to see this guy, General Hugo Torres, when he went to the police department's hospital and literally died. He may have spent 15 or 20 minutes of what was left of his life with his family members. But I was the oldest person at El Chipote, and I think they were afraid that I might die. And they couldn't afford to have a second person die in jail. So every morning, I remember around 8 or 9 a.m., they'd call me, they'd take my blood pressure, and then in the afternoon, they would call me and take my blood pressure also. But it wasn't really, I think, so much out of humanity, but out of a concern that I might die and that this would be another sort of source of bad news coming out of Chipote, which could be reflected on the treatment they were giving us.
Do you feel that the regime finally released you in hopes of avoiding sanctions, or what was the regime's calculus in releasing large group of prisoners, but then turning around and arresting others, including Monsignor Alvarez?
Well, Alvarez was already arrested when I was still in jail. He was initially under house arrest. He was a bishop, the Bishop of Matagalpa, and Nicaragua is still, in its majority, a Catholic country. It's no longer 99% Catholic and 1%, let's say, agnostics or atheists or something else. But it's still overwhelmingly Catholic. And Rolando Alvarez had been captured with 5 or 6 of the priests of the Diocese of Matagalpa, and he was first held under house arrest. But I think he was subsequently taken to our jail. Certainly, the other priests were at El Chipote. I think that the whole idea was to try. Maybe we were bleeding them to death financially. I mean, there were 222 of us who were eating 3 times a day. And internationally, the vast majority of the important countries, the important partners of Nicaragua in development were very concerned about the fact that there were so many prisoners, political prisoners in Nicaragua, and people like me who weren't even involved in politics. I wrote an article in la prensa, which was entitled A propósito de sanciones, with regard to sanctions. And basically the conclusion of that article was that sanctions didn't work. I'm sure that what happened is that Vice President or Co-President Murillo saw the title and said, this guy is making a case for U.S. sanctions against Nicaragua, which to me suggests that she hadn't taken the time to even read the article. But I always believe that that's what caused them to arrest me. And I think they believe that I was calling for sanctions in Nicaragua, which is not the case. And with regard to sanctions in particular, the reality is that in Nicaragua and most places, they don't really have a big impact, especially when the sanctions take the form of the withdrawal of visas to the U.S. For most of the people who are in the Sandinista government, certainly including Daniel Ortega and Rosario Murillo, there's no interest in going to Disneyland. They don't need to go to Miami to have doctors try to cure them. If they were sanctioned by their true partners, Iran, Russia, People's Republic of China, et cetera, that might get to them, but not a prohibition to travel to the U.S. So the sanctions that the U.S. has used on Nicaragua, with one notable exception that I'll come to in a second, basically have consisted of taking away the visa to come into the U.S. And as I said, I don't think that really bothers very much senior officials in the Sandinista government. The only other sanction that they applied to us was the removal of Nicaragua from the countries that were able to take advantage of something called the sugar quota. That is a preferred price that the U.S. provides for countries that are friendly to the U.S. when it buys sugar for them. And we're talking about cane sugar here. And in this case, the premium that they pay is about $6 million. Now that doesn't go to the government, it goes to the major sugar estates in Nicaragua. But it was the only sanction imposed by the U.S. government when I was in Nicaragua that had an economic impact on anyone, but it wasn't the government. It was on the large sugar estates. Now that made them uncomfortable, it made them, if anything, less sympathetic to the government, but it was the only sanction that did not consist of negation of a visa.
You mentioned Russia and China. What is the role today of Russia and China in Nicaragua?
Let's start with China. Up until about 2 years ago, the Nicaraguan government had maintained diplomatic relations with the Republic of China, Taiwan, including during the Sandinista years. Don't forget that Daniel Ortega was elected, quote unquote, to the presidency of Nicaragua on various occasions. In fact, since 1979, when the Sandinista revolution began, to the present, he has been president of Nicaragua for 43 years. Not all in one fell, not all in a single period, but between different elections that he has, quote, won, unquote. He's been in the presidential palace now for 43 years in Nicaragua. And of those 43 years, 41 of those has been with the Republic of Taiwan, China. At one point, maybe, not maybe, during the time that I was in El Chipote, they decided to switch partners. And they cut relations with the Republic of China, Taiwan, and established relations with the People's Republic of China. They are trying to get closer and closer to the PRC, but you know, the PRC has been around in this game of supporting developing countries for quite a while, and Nicaragua was a latecomer. And I don't think that they will get a lot of mileage out of that, the relationship with the PRC. And they were getting a lot of support from the Republic of China, Taiwan. I don't know why they decided to switch horses, but maybe they feel that the PRC would be, because it is now a world power, a better ally to have. But Russia's relationship with Nicaragua is very, very well established. It goes back to 1979. Daniel Ortega, his wife, his sons, They all go to Russia. They can't go to the European countries anymore, by the way, which means that one of their sons, the oldest son, who fancies himself to be a great opera singer, he can no longer go to Milano to watch La Scala, but I guess he goes and watches ballets in Russia now, because he does go there frequently. But Russia has very close ties with our military. Most of the equipment that they have is Russian-made, although the Navy has bought some hand-me-down Coast Guard cutters from the Netherlands. But it's essentially because the U.S. has distanced itself from our military, and that's in part because Daniel Ortega, for example, has never allowed young graduates of our military academy to come to the U.S. to finish off their training in the military arts. I remember that on several occasions there were U.S. offers to take the first or second or third graduates from our military academy to come to the U.S. And the Army at that time, I'm talking 5-6 years ago, was very keen on their coming here. But Daniel Ortega vetoed that because he knew that he needed to have an army that was totally, let's say, tied to the Russian military in particular. The relationship with Iran is a newer one. They obviously are looking forward to getting some support from Iran in the form of either better prices on petroleum or just because they feel that Iran is a country that has tendentious relations with the U.S., then it's a country that presumably would be a good ally to have, since Daniel Ortega has a very poor regard, and his wife an even poorer one, for the U.S. I don't know what it is about them, but they really view the United States as the world's, how should I put this, the empire. They refer to it as the empire, the country that tries to control the rest of the world, and they don't want to be controlled by the U.S. But we have 250,000 Nicaraguans who want to go to the U.S., who are at your southern border. At least last year they were at your southern border. 80% of the remittances that we receive from Nicaraguans who are not in the country come from Nicaraguans who live here in the U.S. 60% of our trade is with the U.S. So here we have a government that can't stand the U.S. government, but the country is in a very, how should I say this, a very tight relationship with the U.S. in economic and human terms. We now have, I would say, maybe 500,000 Nicaraguans who live here in the United States. Before Daniel came to power in the second go-round, let's say, that number may have been 100,000. And most of those probably came during the Contra War and or trying to escape Nicaragua during those years.
I want to come back to how the United States should use its leverage. But before that, the Freedom House's Freedom in the World survey shows the steady deterioration in political freedom in Nicaragua. As recently as 2017, Nicaragua was in the partly free category. And in Freedom House's most recent report, Nicaragua is only a few points better than Cuba. Is it fair to think of Nicaragua as another Cuba, or are there substantive differences between these regimes?
I think that Cuba is a role model for Daniel Ortega. By the way, many of his bodyguards are Cubans, and they go around wearing guayaberas, and we can tell by their accents that they are of Cuban extraction. No, Daniel and Rosario are very fond of Cuba, but they're also very fond of Venezuela. They're very fond of Russia. They're very fond of Iran. And they're trying to become very fond of the People's Republic of China. That's their world right now internationally. And the situation in Nicaragua has in fact deteriorated considerably. And this is resulting in not only Nicaraguans trying to come here to the US, but Nicaraguans who have inundated completely Costa Rica, who are now working in large numbers in Panama as well. And it's a situation where Central America and some of the governments of Central America have tried to maintain a relationship with Nicaragua because they're leftists in many of these Central American countries, and what their governments believe is that they need to be careful in how they deal with the Ortegas, who have provided, by the way, refugee status to a number of Central American presidents who had to leave their countries because they were accused of corruption and/or money laundering while they were in their countries. So we have a number of guests in Nicaragua who come from some of our neighboring countries who could not go back to their own countries right now.
One of the main lifelines for the regime is the support they receive from the Central American Bank for regional integration. What can be done to cut off that support?
Well, that's an interesting. You're very well informed. You're talking about the Batlle, which is normally a tiny bank, and that tiny bank normally has very few operations in Nicaragua. The main banks that provided us traditionally in Nicaragua with foreign assistance are the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. But these three that I just mentioned to you are more careful about whom they lend to. They say that they're not political, and in great measure that's true, but they do follow the economics of the country, and they are concerned about things like accusations of corruption, money laundering, etc. In fact, the most recent IMF report on Nicaragua goes into these issues in a way that is very uncharacteristic of the International Monetary Fund. But within this framework, what happened was that Batlle, or the Central American Bank, in which the US doesn't have a voice or a vote, basically began to bankroll the Nicaraguan government. The Nicaraguan government was the prime beneficiary of financing from Batlle in all of Central America. And I guess the U.S. felt that since it was not a shareholder and doesn't have a vote, that it couldn't really say, well, why are you doing this? But that surprises me a little bit, because a good part of the money that Batlle does on lend to Central American countries is raised on the capital markets of the U.S. And the U.S. government, I know for a fact, in many cases closes its foreign exchange markets to countries with which it does not have good relations. There has just been a change in the presidency of Batlle. Dante Mossi, who was the guy in charge of the bank, was not reelected. I think that somehow, miraculously, the majority of the Central American presidents or finance ministers decided that it was time for a change at the Batlle. But this tiny little bank turned into a colossus in terms of financial support to Nicaragua during basically the last 10 years that Ortega has been in power. Very unpredictable and very unfortunate for, I believe, Batlle's reputation.
You've described the great leverage that the United States has with Nicaragua in terms of trade and remittances. What should the United States be doing to help hold the Ortega regime accountable and to help set the conditions for change in Nicaragua?
Before I answer that question, let me give you a couple of examples of how those relations between Nicaragua and the U.S. are going. Kevin Sullivan, who was the U.S. ambassador in Nicaragua for the last 4.5 years, came back to Washington. I think he just arrived here yesterday or maybe a couple of days ago. But as long ago as maybe 6 or 8 months ago, it was clear that he was going to be going home. And the U.S. had named, with what is called the agreement, the agreement of the Nicaraguan government, that another person would be going to Nicaragua to replace Sullivan. That person occupies a senior position in the State Department, even as we speak today. And the U.S. government and the Nicaraguan government had given its okay for this guy. But then in one of his moments of, let's say, fury about some slight that he perceived to have received from the U.S. government, they withdrew that agreement. So the U.S. could no longer send the person that they had already sent to Congress for ratification to Nicaragua. So this particular individual had already gone through the vetting process in the Senate. And all of a sudden, the Nicaraguan government says this guy's no longer welcome here. So right now, what the U.S. has done is to withdraw that the current ambassador Sullivan and to send a chargé d'affaires. They've lowered, in other words, the level at which the Nicaraguan embassy is going to be in Nicaragua. I don't know if that will mean that Nicaragua here will recall their ambassador here and name a chargé d'affaires. That's normally what happens in diplomacy. It's tit for tat. You lower your representation, we'll lower ours. But the reality is that relations between Nicaragua and the U.S. are strained still today in diplomatic terms. But in terms of sanctions, as I said a little while ago, it basically consists of telling people who don't really want to come to the U.S., you can't come here. And then people wonder why it is that the sanctions are working, why it is that the conditions in Nicaragua haven't improved since these sanctions have been in effect for quite a long while, and they're not affecting change in Nicaragua. But as I said, for Daniel Ortega, for Rosario Murillo, for their sons and daughters, not coming to the U.S. is not a big deal. Not even being able to go to Western Europe is a big deal for them. They traveled to Iran, they traveled to Russia. Now they'll be able to go to Beijing, try some good food there. But it's very clear to me that the sanctions in Nicaragua are not working. And this is just an objective reality. And anyone who looks into the situation in Nicaragua would come to the same conclusion. I wanted to also mention that the Nicaraguan government, I think I already mentioned to you, has very bad relations with the Catholic Church in the country. But it also has done something that I don't recall any other Latin American country, including Cuba, has ever done. And that is to expel the papal nuncio, who is the ambassador of the Vatican in the country. In countries like Nicaragua, by definition, the papal nuncio is the dean of the diplomatic corps. He may have arrived only a day or two before, but he automatically, as a courtesy to the church, is the dean. But Nicaragua is one of the few countries, I think in all of Latin America, maybe the only one, that no longer has a papal nuncio, and we don't have one because he was expelled by the Ortega regime, even though I know for a fact that this particular nuncio made a special effort to maintain channels of communication continuously with the regime. In one of his diatribes, his Sunday homilies, Daniel Ortega actually said that the Catholic Church was corrupt, that the Catholic Church, who was the Pope anyhow? Who elected the Pope? And then he said, there's just 80 old men elect the Pope. Why don't they have free elections the way we have here in Nicaragua, where all the priests in the world can vote for the Pope? It's the kind of stuff that is vintage Daniel Ortega and Rosario Murillo, and may have an impact on some of their followers. But I really don't think they have many followers. I recall in the year 2018 that we had street demonstrations every week. One of them had 1 million people, not exaggerated, 1 million people marching against the regime. Others had 300,000 or 400,000 or 500,000. And in an attempt to disperse the crowds, 350 of my compatriots were gunned down and killed by the police, by the riot police, the same ones who were at this DOEP, this prison that I was at. And, that's a hard thing for a country to go through. 350 people shot, rallies in a country of 6 million, of 1 million people. That's extraordinary. We'd never had that kind of a rally in our lives, and it was completely spontaneous. But the government said that every one of those million people, every one of those persons had received $10 from the U.S. Embassy. So according to Daniel Ortega, the U.S. government had dispersed $10 million to get those 1 million people in the streets of Nicaragua. And of course, that's ludicrous, it's ridiculous.
So going back to the sanctions, we know that these targeted visa sanctions don't work. Is there another form of sanction that that we should be considering?
Well, I don't want to get into what the U.S. should or should not do in terms of Nicaragua. There are some people at the State Department who have very clear views of what's going on in Nicaragua. As I said, their candidate to go to Nicaragua as ambassador was not accepted. So now they've downgraded that office there. That will be perceived in diplomatic circles as another form of pressure. But Daniel Ortega couldn't give really a damn about whether they have a deputy chief of mission or an ambassador or a chargé d'affaires. That doesn't bother him one darn bit. I mentioned to you the sugar quota. That didn't really impact on the Ortegas either, because the main losers there were the important sugar estates in Nicaragua. But I don't want to get into what the U.S. ought to do. What I do believe is that the U.S. government, at least the people that I've discussed with in the U.S. government over the years, know very well that there is a problem in Central America. They attempted to use the leverage of suspending Nicaragua from the OAS as a way of forcing the government to abandon its despotism and to move back to democracy. But Daniel just said, we're out of the OAS. By the way, I just looked this morning into the official page of the OAS, and they still show Nicaragua as a member, even though Nicaragua was already formally withdrawn from the OAS. So I guess that news hasn't quite, been internalized by the OAS yet. But Daniel Ortega doesn't lose a lot of sleep over not being in what he calls the Ministry of Colonies of the United States. That's how he refers to the OAS.
One of the aspects of the mass imprisonment that many people don't consider is it's not only taking political adversaries out of the arena, but it's also affecting families, and the effects continue. Today there are, as I understand, 150 minor children in Nicaragua whose parents have been deported and stripped of their Nicaraguan citizenship. Could you speak to the broader effects of Nicaragua's use of imprisonment on Nicaraguan society more broadly?
Well, I don't think we've ever had, not even in the worst moments of the Somoza dictatorship, so many people simultaneously arrested and imprisoned for political crimes. Make-believe political crimes, unless being in favor of human rights, unless being in favor of democratic elections every 4, or in our case, every 5 years, unless you call those crimes. It's very hard for the wives of political prisoners, the close relatives, including the kids of political prisoners, to either leave Nicaragua or maybe return to Nicaragua. I've heard of cases, and I've heard of cases from people who are responsible, where this has happened. In some cases, the wife of someone who came on that freedom flight, and I want to talk a little bit about that if we can before this interview is over. The February 3, 2023 freedom flight, which was really an extraordinary experience for me. Even in the case of those people who came on the freedom flight, it's already been, 3-4 months since that occurred, and these people have not been able to bring their wives to the U.S. or their kids to the U.S. A few have. And when these people arrive, it's usually because they somehow snuck across the border to Costa Rica and they're gone on a plane and flew to the U.S. It obviously is a great moment for those fellow cellmates of mine to be with their families. But these people are scattered all over the U.S. right now. Some are in Houston, some are in Atlanta, some are here in the Washington area, some are out in California. Maybe the largest group are in Miami, but many of them are sort of at their wits' end because their families are not with them, or because some members of their family came to Nicaragua, But to the U.S., but when I return home to Nicaragua, I'm very homesick for my country. And I think everyone who's a Nicaraguan who is here right now, much as we enjoy and like the U.S., we still miss our countries. In my own case, I'm retired. I used to get Social Security payments from our government after having made contributions to that to our system, and those Social Security payments have been stopped for me and for all the other prisoners who were receiving them. And there are many other ways in which we have been made to disappear. For example, I asked my wife to bring me a copy of my birth certificate. And she went to the registrar in Nicaragua to try to get a copy of my birth certificate, and the people there said, it doesn't exist here. We don't have any birth certificate for Francisco Aguirre-Sacasa. So there's a systematic attempt underway right now in Nicaragua to cause us to disappear from the Nicaraguan scenario perpetually. As far as they're concerned, we no longer exist, and they've said that explicitly. This is their objective. We're never going to go back, and we don't exist anymore. And that's a very terrible thing to do to a citizen of a country. I still consider myself to be a Nicaraguan. All of the others were on that flight with me, the other 221. All of us consider ourselves to still be Nicaraguans, but none of us right now could go back to Nicaragua, and their families would not be able to go to the registrars in Nicaragua and bring back some basic information that is normally required to be able to acquire another nationality somewhere else. So they're playing hardball in Nicaragua in a way that no government before in our history has ever done it. 350 people killed in weeks of marches. And it was not a two-way firefight. There was overwhelming riot police actions against unarmed civilians.
Tell us more about the Freedom Flight.
That was extraordinary. As I said, it was the morning of February 3rd. I think it must have been about 2 a.m. in the morning. And they began to knock on this steel door that we had, which they would sometimes do in normal times to wake us up at night. They did not like us to have a good night's sleep. There were interrogations sometimes, none a day, sometimes once a day, twice, or even 3 times a day. The idea was to keep us off balance, I think. And here they knocked the door, and I said, not again. But this was at 3 a.m., and all of a sudden, I was the first guy they called. And they said, they handed me a little plastic bag where I had civilian clothes, because from time to time, towards the end of our imprisonment, we were finally allowed to have a lunch with our wives or our family members. I think we had 2 of those during the year and a half that I was in jail. And so we had the civilian garb. And he said, take off your prisoner garb and put this on. And so all 3 of us had to put it on, and we didn't know what the heck was happening. This was 3 a.m. And then, I don't want to make this story very long, but all of a sudden, all 220 of us were in one large, sort of like cell, very large. And we were all wearing civilian garb, and we were all wondering what was going to happen with us. We had no idea. It never occurred to us that we would be 2 hours later on a flight that had been chartered by the U.S. government to bring us to the U.S. No idea whatsoever. We thought we were being moved from our prison jail to the common jail, which was towards the north of Nicaragua, which is the same direction as the airport is. There were so many of us, there must have been about 10 or 15 buses. School buses, like your school buses here, but they were police buses. And all of a sudden we see that they'd closed off all the windows, so we couldn't tell where we were traveling. And we were told, of course, to keep our mouths shut. And all of a sudden we took a detour And instead of continuing to that common prison, we were all of a sudden in the airport. We didn't know we were at the airport until the buses stopped and the doors opened, and we began to see that around us were some buildings that we associated with our airport. And then each of us was asked to sign in the bus a piece of paper. And we said, there were no lights inside the bus. And they said, you know, a number of us said, well, what do you want us to sign? He said, either you sign this or you don't get off the bus. And one by one, each of us began to sign this because we knew we were at the airport by then. And it began to dawn on us that something important might be happening to us. So we got off the buses and we were right on the tarmac. And in front of us was a very large 767, a chartered aircraft. And I remember that it was at that moment that it dawned on me that I was going to get on that aircraft. And all I could think of was those American diplomats who had been in Tehran and who had been sequestered at the embassy back then, and who came back, I think, the last day of the Carter presidency or the first day of the Reagan presidency. All I could think of was that this was going to be our version of that, but a much larger number of people. And it was cold. It was cold in the morning there. February is still a cool month in Managua, and especially at 3 or 4 in the morning. And all of a sudden, I saw a box there, and then they said, Aguirre-Sacasa. And so I moved forward, and they gave me a passport, a Nicaraguan passport. But it wasn't my old passport with all the visas and everything. It was a brand new passport. I don't know who issued that passport, but it was a Nicaraguan passport because the name that appeared in that passport was the way my name is managed here and not the way my name is used in Nicaragua. And as soon as I had that, I began to, and they said, move towards the aircraft. And I saw an American State Department personnel, a woman who had been the deputy chief of mission years earlier in Nicaragua. And when I saw her and she saw me, I gave her a tremendous bear hug. And I didn't want to let go of her. And she said, you're going home, Francisco. And I couldn't believe it. And to this day, I think she and I will never forget that moment because I gave her, as I said, that big bear hug. And then I jumped on that thing. And even though I had that hip problem and everything, I managed to get up on that plane so fast. I don't think an Olympic track runner would have been able to catch me at that point. And when the plane was full, it was absolutely, completely full, and they shut the door, we were still sort of crossing our fingers in the hopes that the plane would take off and get out of Nicaraguan airspace. But I remember as soon as that door shut, spontaneously on that aircraft, we all began to sing the national anthem of Nicaragua. And little by little, we were getting informed that we were going to the U.S., that we were going to Miami, that we were going instead to Washington. And it was just a sensational trip. It took us maybe almost 4 hours to make the trip, but it went by like that. I mean, very quick. There was a lot of internal combustion of a positive kind there. There were a lot of ex-Nicaraguan or U.S. diplomats. They may still have been in the Foreign Service, but they had been in Nicaragua before. They had been selected because they knew that they would be known by many of the people who were on that plane from Nicaragua. And it was just a wonderful, wonderful chemistry there. We called it the Freedom Flight. And I remember that from time to time, someone from the back of the plane or the front of the plane or the middle of the plane would yell out a slogan, a political slogan, and all of us would immediately give him the response to that slogan. None of them pro-Sandinista, by the way. But it was just a remarkable flight. The reception at the airport, at Dulles Airport, was fantastic. I remember that there was a senior State Department guy who accompanied me. By then, they had mercy on me and they put me on a wheelchair because of my hip problem. But I remember at one moment I went to see, because they had doctors there, I went to see these doctors and nurses. And there was a senior guy from the State Department there. He said to me, do you want to call someone from your family? So he gave me a cell phone, and I looked at him, and I realized I was going to speak to someone from my family. And I began to cry like a baby. But what's extraordinary is that he began to cry, because it was so emotional. The whole thing was so emotional. In less than 24 hours, I'd gone from being someone who was in jail, who had been in jail for 550 days, who all of a sudden was in the United States and in a free country. And that was the first time that I really understood what freedom was all about. We talk about it, a lot in places like the Hudson Institute and the IRI and the NDI, and I would write about it and talk about it. But it was that moment that I fully understood what it meant to be deprived of freedom and to be free. It was extraordinary. It's an experience that I'll never forget.
Francisco, on that note, thank you for coming to Hudson, for telling us about your ordeal. Thanks for helping make known what the regime in Nicaragua is doing. Really, without the courage of people like you, regimes like the Ortega Murillo regime would continue with impunity, but sharing your story, people at least know the truth about what is happening. To our audience, thank you for joining us today.
Good.